So maybe this is for you, Carolyn, because I don't know that the rest of us could answer. What is the track record of AMI as a mining company?
Well, Arizona Mining was a junior Canadian mining company and never did any mining. The way that the development typically happens for mining companies is a junior Canadian company goes out and develops a mine site, does a lot of the initial permitting and exploratory drilling for what is the value that is there. And so Arizona Mining never operated. They have sold that now. The title now goes to this company, South 32, which is an Australian mining company. And they demerged from BH Billiton in 2015. So a short record, but a relatively good record. Another self-confession, for a period of time, I co-owned a power line construction company. And I worked on mining property in Florida, mostly phosphate mining property. I'm actually MSHOL certified. And as a construction person, I can go onto the site and recognize the pride that these workers are taking in the remediation work that they are doing up there right now, which is an important distinction too. This is not mining that's happening up right there. This is remediation work that they are required to do in order to get title for it. So they haven't actually started mining yet, and I have wandered, and I don't know how far away I am from answering that question.
It works for me. The next question has to do with what is the joint impact of Rosemont and AMI, it's really, I guess, the Patagonia mine, on our water. And obviously the water sources are really coming from quite different places. Are you up for that?
Yeah, I mean, they're distinct hydrologically in terms of the mine near Patagonia is going to affect the Patagonia Mountains and the Sorority Creek, whereas Rosemont will affect Davidson Canyon and probably the Tucson Basin, may or may not affect the upper portions of Seneca Creek. That's probably up for debate, I would say. And so they're distinct. I mean, I think they do bring sort of large mining. I mean, in terms of the Tucson Basin, essentially east and western boundaries of the basin will have large open pit mines operating if Rosemont were to open. So.
Yeah, and I think maybe from a species standpoint that should be addressed, because I think that's another issue, is that here we have this important landscape, and how does that work relative to the species that might rely on that landscape?
Well, there's also endangered species in the Seneca Creek natural area. There's top minnow populations are in there. There's also the Chiricahua leopard frog, the Chiricahua leopard, lowland leopard frog, sorry. I'm not a herpetologist.
Chiricahua leopard frog too.
The Chiricahua leopard. Right. There's also chub that are found in the Seneca Creek. So, it's all connected by these watersheds, and all aquatic species are under increasing pressure from dewatering, from exotic species introductions, and also from contaminants and acidification from mining processes.
And just to follow up real quick, just a question on that for the group, maybe they know more than me about this, but in terms of wildlife corridors and large habitat, not just T&E species, but all the other critters that folks rely on, not only for birding, but for all their tourism and just the way of life and the existence as we live in the natural world, I think you get a cumulative effect that might need to be recognized as well, yes?
Yes, and as you impact more and more areas so that there's smaller amounts of natural areas, you lose both abundance and diversity of communities. So if you continually isolate species onto smaller and smaller postage stamps, then they will have deleterious effects to the overall biodiversity of the region.
So if you're essentially giving advice to the Patagonia residents, is there one thing that you're most concerned about, or one piece of advice that you think you would, and of course this may or may not be something Carolyn wants to answer, but for the rest of you, but you do have a response? Okay. So why don't we start with you then? And just in terms of a piece of advice, and what is it that you are most concerned about with the whole panoply of impacts we're talking about?
The thing I am most concerned about is people getting discouraged and giving up, because that is the number one thing the mining companies would like us to do. So we have to keep standing up and speaking out and continuing to resist. It is important. The bottom line for this company, which they repeat in all their public presentations, is currently they are forecasting a 48% rate of return after taxes. That's plenty of spare change to do this better than they intend to.
I think an important sort of take-home message is this is in your backyard, it's going to impact you, but we also have to look at the region in general. And I think it's a big picture. So while you're focused on this one area, the Patagonia area, which is extremely important, I think we also need to look at the bigger picture, both in the state and federal level, into updating both law, which I know absolutely nothing about, and water issues, which I've become more and more educated about because the fish are an important component of that.
Well, I would echo Carolyn, don't give up. I've worked with folks, many of my clients are tribes, federally recognized Indian tribes, and they're still here, and they haven't given up, and they persist. I would say that persistence is critical. I would say the other thing, educate yourself. Don't be afraid to find out about this project. Don't be afraid to learn. Don't think someone else knows more than you. I'm a water lawyer. I work on cultural resources and environmental law, but I'm the first one to go down to Arizona Department of Environmental Quality and pull the permits and read it soup to nuts. And you'd be surprised what you can learn. And you can educate yourself, so you don't have to listen to what the mining company necessarily says, and take it with a grain of salt. Read about it, learn. Don't be afraid to Google it. Don't be afraid to pull their permits. Don't be afraid to do a public records request. If this is something that concerns you, this is your life, it's your future, and it's the future of this region. And every one of us, I think, shouldn't be intimidated or talked over or bullied in terms of learning for ourselves and taking ownership of that and then taking action.
I would say in terms of, I'll focus on the hydrology, that understanding how the Patagonias work, particularly in terms of surface springs and how they may or may not be affected by the mine's operation, requires characterizing them now before the mine begins operation to understand how the system works now, to then be able to document what impacts the mine is or is not having on the groundwater in the system. As you know, as noted, the geology of the Patagonias is very complicated. As a result, the hydrogeology is very complicated. But springs provide us this place where groundwater meets the sky, and a way to understand how that groundwater system is expressing at the surface and how it affects biota and ultimately surface water quality as well. So,
I guess I'd jump in and say I'm going to actually follow up on what you just said, Tom, because I think the idea of establishing baselines across the board is absolutely critical, whether it's air quality, species diversity, numbers of trucks passing through, whatever it is that can be documented at this point as a baseline for what goes forward. Because as far as I can tell, there's a lot of unanswered questions here, especially about the hydrology. Many of these other things, like the connection between changes in air quality and changes in water quality and species survivability, I think is certainly better understood in terms of at least the general trends. But in terms of understanding what's going on with fractured rock hydrology and how precisely the discharges from the water treatment plant are going to affect downstream water quality and a range of other issues, the impacts of trucks going in and out of whichever direction they go, huge air quality and nighttime light, and then the blasting, what the implications are for birds. Obviously for Audubon, the implications for bird habitat and bird species are critical, but also the experience of people who are engaged in recreation, are really interested in experiencing nature in a relatively untrammeled context, may not be too pleased when they're confronting, giant dump trucks full of ore every 20 seconds. So those are things that we really need to be concerned about. Well, I think we've pretty much probably exhausted our panelists, And we have not exhausted your questions, and for that I apologize. But I see there are people who are still desperate to ask questions. How are we doing? Should we take a couple more, or what do you think? It's 8.
I would invite people to mingle. The panelists
Come
are
up,
willing to
yeah.
hang around for a couple minutes to ask maybe some more of those individualized questions. There are people getting up to leave. So I think we wrap it up, and if you guys can mingle, that would be great. Is that okay?
Yeah, so feel free to come up and ask any panelist anything you'd like. I see you seem somewhat anxious, yes.
I am anxious. I'm sorry. I don't normally do this. This mine only has a 19-year lifetime. 19 years of mining for hundreds of years of destruction. That is what really makes me angry.
So the point was they have a 19-year lifetime. In theory, we've heard that from many mining companies before, but the damage associated could go on for centuries or perhaps longer. So, okay, on that note, why don't we call it a day and thank our panelists so much. And the people who put the film together and those who contributed. Thanks to all of you. And go forth and save the world. Thank you very much.